that he came to Derbe and Lystra, and there was a certain disciple there named Timothy. So, you know, in our class we have Tim 1 and Tim 2, and this is Tim 3 and maybe Tim 4. So there's a lot of Tims running around. There's even a Tim in the text. So Timothy, it tells us, was the son of a Jewish that had believed, and his father was a Greek. Now, in verse 2 of chapter 16, the same was well reported of the brethren there in Lystra. And so Paul takes him and was going to take him on his way, or as they're on this journey, if you will. And so what's rather interesting in this verse, it tells us that he takes him and he circumcises him. You know, that's a mystery to me, because as you look at this text, in chapter 15, there had been an entire council come to Jerusalem in which they had this discussion. They had a great dispute, if you will, that was ongoing about the relationship of the Gentiles and the Jews, and in particular, this very issue of circumcision. Now, today in our society, we don't see this as too much of a dispute or problem, but doctrinally, as we looked at on the previous occasion, you remember Peter had recounts the fact that he had had a vision, that God had given him a direct command that whatever he makes clean, not to make unclean. And with that, Peter comes to a certain conclusion. The text uses a phrase that he perceived, or he concluded. What was it that his conclusion was? God's not a respecter of... That's right. There's no distinction between a Jew and a Gentile. We're all the same. It doesn't matter who you are, where you're from, or what color your skin is. We're all alike. We're all created, if you will, in the image of God. As far as salvation, he so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that what? Whosoever. That's the key word. Well, as you look at this, you remember James had gone back to the Old Testament and recounts from Amos, and then they had this observation that the apostles had not commanded this, and then so they issued what's referred to. And see if your text reads like mine does in Acts chapter 16 and verse 4. Now, look at yours and see if your text reads like mine. And they went out on their way through the cities, and they delivered to them the decree. Mr. Kendrick, does yours use the word decree? This is Acts 16 and verse 4. Is yours the inspired version? Darrell? The decree, everybody's using a decree. Does anybody use a different word? Oh, here's somebody that's got a radical version. What does it say, Tim Beaver? Decision. A decision, all right. They made a decision. They made an ordinance, if you will, some have said. You know, in the religious world, we have what's referred to as councils. There are those that go back to this text in Acts chapter 15, and they say, therefore we have councils, and there is a decision that is made, a decree. Okay, what was the decree? Was it necessary for, what was the Jews wanting for the Gentiles. What did they want the Gentiles to do? Say again? Be circumcised. And you had to follow the law of Moses. Of course, that was one of the primary focuses, was circumcision, because to be a Jew, you needed to be circumcised. Well, I find this rather striking. After all of this event in chapter 15, here we go to chapter 16, and the first thing he does, he's got this new convert, this new person who's following with him, and what does he do? In verse 3, him would Paul have to go forth with him, and so he took him and he circumcises him. My goodness, we already had this big event. We already had this big discussion. We have already had the decree. It's not necessary. What are we going to do? Well, if I was Timothy, I'd say, hey, wait just a moment, Paul. I know, first of all, you're a lawyer and you're not a doctor, and I'm not having medical procedures by a doctor. Well, that might be me. I would push back, But I have to say, as I've looked at this, I have asked the question, why? Don't you ask that question, why? I used to always say, why? Because to me, I have to know an answer for it. Does it give us an explanation in this verse? It does, doesn't it? Watch the text there, and it's in verse 3. He took him and he circumcised him, and there's a word. It says because. Because of what? Because of the Jews. Well, there's still something going on in the background, isn't there? Something's still happening. Now, yes, Mr. Beaver?
I was just say, to me, this is almost the same decision they came to, because the point about those four things you talked about was in every city there's a synagogue of Moses. And the idea was to not do things that would antagonize or get in the way of the gospel reaching the heart of the people.
I like the question you say, antagonize. Do you think people get antagonized? That's an interesting concept. Now, some have suggested that Paul, while it doesn't necessarily give us a detailed explanation in this particular verse, if you cross-reference, and there are two verses that I would suggest you might make a mental note. I have it written in my margin, but when I come over to the text, Paul was writing to the church at Corinth. You remember Corinth, the church at Corinth, the Corinthians had problems. They had a lot of problems, and one of them was this issue of the law of Moses. And in particular, they had problems dealing with eating of certain meats and whether they were things that were sacrificed to idols. And there was all these issues and problems.